Welcome back. Thrilled to have this panel on AI, defense tech, and national security. The moderator is Stephen Kotkin. Stephen is the Kleinherz Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where he directs the Hoover History Lab. He is also a professor of history and international affairs emeritus at Princeton University, where he taught for 33 years. Stephen, I think you're going to introduce the rest of the panel, and so I will leave you to it. Very much looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil. It's indicative of the times that we're in, that we are culminating a day on the economy and the way the world is going with defense tech, AI. Geopolitics has clearly come up all during the day, but I'm not sure that a few years ago this would have been the culminating panel. We have a spectacular group of people up here. Raj Shah, all the way on the far end from me, is one of the people, sort of, I would have to say, at the creation when we move towards a new vision of defense tech. Raj is also an F-16 pilot, and he's very much involved in new tech. I think F-16 kind of is old tech now, although I think a lot of countries wouldn't mind having a nice fleet of F-16s, Raj, but that's how fast things are moving, including with his company. Arati Prabhakar just finished a long stint running the science portfolio for the Biden administration, so right on the front lines. You may have the perception that things are changing with the science portfolio lately, but she has had a bird's eye view to all of these issues and the center of the White House for several years now. And Nicole Perlroth is another product of Princeton.
And Stanford.
But I was going to say, but she overcame that with the Stanford MBA, so that's all forgiven. She's a journalist and an author, well known for writing about cybersecurity and cyber weapons, and now has a company also in that space. So we have three people who know what they're talking about, which is quite unusual for defense tech panels. Everyone's a defense tech AI specialist these days, or so it seems. And so without further ado, my first question to the three panelists is to talk about the state of play from their point of view. Where do they think we are, and how do they understand either how we got here or what the main trends are right now? Raj, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So I'll start by sharing maybe three overview thoughts of kind of where we are in three categories. One is our production system today for defense technology. Two, what changes in warfare we're seeing, which is obvious to most of us and many of us. And then thirdly, what we're seeing on the finance investing side around defense tech. So as a reformed fighter pilot, I always have to start with some stories. I'll start with one to kind of show how we've had two different production systems in this country, one for military weapon systems and one for all the consumer and enterprise software that we benefit from. So it was in 2006. I was in my first deployment as a young lieutenant flying an F-16 in Iraq. It's a wonderful airplane. Our mission was to support ground troops, many of which were operating on the Iranian-Iraqi border. And so my job was to fly circles around them and help them out if they came under attack. Again, wonderful airplane, but it didn't have a moving map GPS. So at 500 miles an hour, there was no way I could look down at the screen and know which side of the border I was on. And there was no convenient lines or markers out in the sand. And so, you have a little inattention, you go a couple miles in the wrong direction, you might, God forbid, start an international incident, or even worse, the general finds out and sends you home. That same year, you could rent a Cessna and have a $100 piece of software on the predecessor to an iPad and know exactly where you were, just like you had MapQuest on your phones. And so it became really obvious to me that, why have we fallen behind in this technology when we should have the best? And we ultimately got it, but it took another 8 years of software development. And so we just have two totally different systems of production, which continues to plague us today, where the F-35, amazing airplane, right, the forefront of fighter aviation, hit initial operating capability in 2016. And the day it actually hit that IOC, your iPhone had a processor 100 times more powerful than the leading fighter jet in the world. Again, why? Requirements were set in 2001. They picked whatever the best was in 2001. And they didn't have a way to separate and understand we need to buy software differently than buy hardware. So that's kind of the first one. It's getting better, but we still have two different systems. The second thing I would note is the Ukraine conflict has given us all a window into what the future of war may look like. It would be very similar to what the cavalry regiments faced in the early 1900s when they first ran into a machine gun. And we've seen now how drones, cheap drones, can alter war. The U.S. sent the Ukrainians 33 M1 Abrams tanks, our lead main battle tank, and 25% of them in the first few weeks were disabled by cheap Russian drones, right? $10,000 drone taking out a $10 million tank, and they had to withdraw them. Now, you can argue maybe we didn't send enough, and they could have done some jamming, and warfare is going to evolve. But I think we're getting a glimpse into why things are going to change and how autonomy and software are going to impact where we might want to make our investments. And I guess it'll be the second part. I'll talk about what I think the future is, but to preview it, Elon's not totally right or totally wrong. We're not going to replace everything with autonomous weapons, but they play a role. I think the third piece that I would overlay on top of this, we are here in the Valley, is the change of interest in defense technology. When I had the opportunity to sort of set up the Pentagon's outpost here about 10 years ago, I calculated that the venture community was putting maybe $200 to $300 million a year into companies and technologies that were serving national security directly. Over the last 3 years, $140 billion have gone into these companies. And we've never seen such a number of smart engineers and entrepreneurs that want to do this. And I think it's for a host of reasons. One, it's an interesting set of problems. Two, again, the Ukraine and Israel conflicts have shown that there are bad actors out there, and defending democracies are important and a worthy mission. But thirdly, and just as important here in the Valley, you can build a real business, right? You can do well and do good too. So I think you're seeing this massive trend that will continue. So that's what it looks like from my perch, Stephen.
Thank you. Very good, Raj. Arati, how does it look to you?
First of all, thank you, Stephen, for convening us. It's great to be here with Nicole and Raj. Haven't seen Raj in a long time, so this is a great treat. I want to start with this. I've been here for most of the day, and I've been surprised to be in this room full of incredibly smart, the high IQ in this room, very well-informed people, and yet the conversation that we're having is one that assumes that what's happening today in our country is business as usual or politics as usual. That's actually not what's happening today. And since this is a panel that's focused on national security, I want to start with the fact that the single biggest threat today to Americans' safety and security is the illegal and unconstitutional actions of the Trump administration. And I think we have to talk about this. So let me just make a few factual observations. We have a president who has repeated Russia's propaganda about the war in Ukraine, a president that has undermined the intelligence and the law enforcement communities in this country because of funding freezes and firings of civil servants. We don't have the tracking and the response to emerging avian flu that's spreading across animals and into humans today. A child just died in the town I grew up in Lubbock, Texas. A child just died of measles, and we have a Secretary of Health and Human Services that is minimizing the impact of that. And the talk of tariffs and all kinds of trade issues are casting, I think, a very long shadow over our economic security. So whether it's health, whether it's the geopolitical issues or economic matters, I think we have some very serious issues. And I want to be very clear that this is not just about policy, it's not about politics, it's not about personalities. This is far more fundamental. It's about the rule of law and the Constitution. And so while all of us would agree that change is needed, and all of us who are sitting on this stage, and I think many others have participated in the changes that are necessary in our government, that's a conversation about remodeling the house. What is happening right now is a nuclear weapon is getting dropped on the house. And I just want to be very, very clear that that's the moment that we are in, and that needs to set the context for this conversation and others. I'll tell you that my personal experience of this moment, I am really heartbroken watching this because I've had the tremendous privilege over 4 decades of participating in some of the most amazing innovations that the world has ever seen, and that really could only have been brought forth in this country. And so I've had the privilege of listening to a soldier tell me about going on patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan and carrying in his pack comms and nav gear that we helped do the research to make that possible. He took that instead of food and water because it was more important to his survival. Every time I pick up my smartphone, I think about all the lithography and semiconductor process technology that I got to be part of that made those devices possible. And the COVID vaccines that saved, the estimate is 20 million lives during this last pandemic. I got to play a small role in that as well with some early work at DARPA. And so I just feel that there is so much at stake. We're going to focus on defense technologies, but that is the bigger picture of what's at stake. So let me turn specifically to the issues of defense technology. I had the great privilege of serving as a program manager early in my career at DARPA. I started the semiconductor office. I then left for 19 years and was not doing anything in national security. That 19-year period included a decade in early stage venture here in Silicon Valley. And then I got the call to go back and run DARPA, and 19 years had lapsed. And I trotted back in, and the world was completely different. And what I learned in being in national security, leaving, and then coming back many years later, the first thing I learned is that all of us in the civilian world, we have the privilege of thinking about national security as one threat at a time. And so today that threat is usually, we think in terms of the strategic competition with China. In my first tour at DARPA, I came to work one day, and the Soviet Union that we thought was going to last forever no longer existed. The Berlin Wall had come down, and the world changed in a very dramatic way. When I came back 19 years later, we were towards the end of 2 ground wars and a period of counterterrorism. And this is 2012, the Pentagon was just starting to turn its attention to the peer competition with China. And now, of course, that's become, that looms very large. But at the same time, the Defense Department still has to do so very many other things. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about the technologies and the capabilities that we need. I want to just use one example. I want to unpack one example for you of what it actually takes to accomplish a complex defense mission, just so that we're clear about what we're really talking about when we're talking about defense technology. And I actually think what we mean when we talk about defense technology, what we care about is not defense technology, but military capability. And military capabilities are systems. And so let me give you one example. On a routine basis today, we have, our Navy is shooting down missiles and drones and rockets that the Houthis are launching from Yemen. And every time they are successful in doing that, and they've been extremely successful, our Navy has been extremely successful in doing that. Think about what that takes. Yes, it takes the missile, it takes the destroyer that the missile is on, but it also takes spaceborne tracking, it takes onboard radars. All of those technical systems have to be synchronized to millisecond range to track position and timing together. in order to close on that target. That's the technical set of systems, and that's it's a bunch of different things, and we love talking about the individual things, but it's actually a whole system and a systems architecture that is extremely complex that has to all work. That's the physical system. Think about the human system that's behind making that weapons release decision. Think about the work that diplomats did to make sure that we could actually operate in that region, and that if we had to fly over another nation's sovereign territory, that could be negotiated in advance. Think about the legal work that is done in the moment to assess where debris will land and whether other assets might be at risk, and to make a legal determination. And we think that's about following the rules. It's actually about making sure that US interests are met by the action that is about to be taken. And I really want to underscore that, because the recent firing of the lead JAGs in the 3 services, I think, is a great example of the kind of risk that we are now facing. So that's part of what goes into all of that human thinking and work and institutional work goes into, finally, that weapons release call that's made by the officer on the deck. So that's the physical system, that's the human and institutional system to get to that decision. What happened before was the acquisition system, which is a whole other thing. The training, the drilling that makes our military service members the most effective on the planet. The maintenance. 18-year-old kids are keeping these systems ready to go at a moment's notice. So I just want to be very clear that that's what we're talking about when we're talking about achieving military objectives, and all the components, the IT systems, the data analytics, all the cool AI, the drones, because we love to talk about drones, all of those are pieces, and they aren't actually the full capability, and that's really what we have to achieve, not just for a relatively unsophisticated adversary that we're facing around the Strait in Yemen, but also for one of the most sophisticated technological capabilities on the planet as we think about where a pure competitor like China can go. So I'll stop with that and turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Nicole. How does it look to you?
Okay, is the camera capturing me sweating? I didn't know this is what I was going to be following. And I want to respond to some of what you said, but I'll start with this. I spent 10 years covering cybersecurity at the New York Times, and it ended up being the most critical decade for cyber attacks in history. And from my little perch at the New York Times, what I saw was this through line. And the through line was this. The through line was the attacks were getting more serious. Each attack sort of laid a new precedent for the attack that would come after that. So you think about, the US and Israel. We launched a mega cyber attack on Iran, on Natanz nuclear facility that dismantled its centrifuges, set back its nuclear ambitions years, dismantled a fifth of its uranium supply, but got out. And I always say, I walked into the New York Times the day Stuxnet got out, and I left after SolarWinds. And what happened was, we don't know how it got out, but it got out, and it didn't do anything to the systems it infected. It just sort of sniffed around because it had clearly been designed with some lawyers standing over the shoulders of these engineers to make sure it only exacted destruction at Natanz. But what it did was it showed the world what was possible with code. And it also just set new rules for the game, which was you can hack into another nation's most critical infrastructure, you can disable it, and so long as you do so with code, you can get away with it probably without serious repercussions. And 2 years later, we saw Iran launch an attack on Saudi Aramco, where they didn't get into the pipelines, although they tried, but they got into the IT systems. They decimated data on 30,000 Aramco computers, and they replaced it with an image of a burning American flag. And that was Iran saying, hi, we might not have the ability to do a Stuxnet, but we can do a lot of harm too. And the next attack was Sony, where North Korea used similar means to basically decimate all the data at Sony, but they added the feature of leaking out executives' emails. And then we saw the DNC, and we saw the emails leaked and weaponized in the 2016 election. You see where this is going. Every attack set a new precedent, and they were getting more and more serious. So that was the first through line. The second was that the barrier to entry was just getting lower and lower and lower. No one has pulled off another Stuxnet attack, but we've seen cyber criminals start pulling off the same effect that Iran pulled off with Saudi Aramco and Sony in North Korea with ransomware. All of these attacks sort of started with a nation state, but eventually these capabilities trickle down. And you saw the ransomware economy get more sophisticated. So, I, who had no technical experience when I got into this, could now launch a sophisticated ransomware attack because I can now rent the ransomware from a cyber criminal group. I can even hire people to do the negotiations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing was happening with spyware, by the way, where suddenly this technology that was always the provenance of intelligence agencies was now in commercial hands, and we were seeing groups like NSO Group in Israel sell spyware to countries that didn't necessarily have the best track record on human rights. And I started covering a lot of these stories about abuses of the spyware that was getting found on the phones of journalists and dissidents and human rights activists. And then finally, the last piece was the attacks started coming for critical infrastructure. We started discovering probes on our own critical infrastructure. We started seeing, again, because this sort of trickled down to ransomware, we saw things like Colonial Pipeline, where they didn't actually get into the pipeline, they got into the IT system, but because the company couldn't see its billing or do billing, and they didn't necessarily have the confidence in their air gap that these cyber criminals wouldn't get into the pipeline itself, they shut the whole thing down. And we got a very close glimpse at what a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure could look like. And by the way, when I was at the New York Times covering that attack, I got my hands on a confidential DOE assessment that said, as a country, we could have only afforded 3 more days of downtime. And it wasn't so much the gas or the oil or the jet fuel, it was the diesel required to run our factories. And so suddenly, things started to look really bad. And we also started to see these supply chain attacks like SolarWinds, where Russian intelligence agency, compromised SolarWinds, this Texas software company, and used its software update as a Trojan horse to get into a number of federal agencies, and also I think it was more than 90% of the Fortune 500 used this software. So that's when I left the New York Times. And I left the New York Times because I went inside the Biden administration to try and help, and I went to CISA and sat on their advisory board and sat in a SCIF for the first time, which is really weird as a journalist to go suddenly be invited into a SCIF, and I'm sitting across from people who are like, why is she here? And I can tell you, part of what they told me, because they declassified it, which was at my first meeting in a SCIF, Russia's going to invade Ukraine. At that point, it was like 3 months later. And we're very worried about the potential for cyber blowback. And that's sort of where I spent most of my thought and time and energy over the last 4 years, was on the issue of Ukraine's cyber defense and also our cyber defense. Should Russia engage on a lot of the access that they already have in our critical infrastructure? And it really just, coming back to some of your comments, came down to this amazing collaboration that sprang up between the public and private sector, and also with our allies. And a lot of the reason that Ukraine still has a fighting chance today, I believe, is because of that amazing collaboration and those multilateral relationships. And I think that's where I worry the most about what's happening today, while we've all been sitting here watching this meeting between Zelensky and J.D. Vance and Trump. It would be a crying shame because, make no mistake, the defense of Ukraine is the deterrence on Taiwan. And we have learned so much from Ukraine that we can apply to Taiwan. And what's happening right now, I don't even know how to make sense of it. Okay, Taiwan brings me to China. The biggest cyber threat to the United States today is China. To borrow the words of Rob Joyce, who until recently was our nation's top hacker at the NSA, Russia's the hurricane. They come at us hard and fast. China is climate change. They're incredibly strategic. And from my time at the New York Times, I broke a lot of these Chinese cyber attacks, including against my own employer, which I always call my Stanford Business School education in cybersecurity. And in the beginning, it was IP theft. And they came for our R&D, and we don't talk enough about what was stolen. Yeah. We don't talk enough about what happened to Nortel, which is gone, and basically Huawei stole all their market share. We don't talk enough about American factory towns that were making these solar panels, and then suddenly they had to lay off everyone because China stole their critical IP. And then they came for personal data, but right now the biggest threat is that they're in the infrastructure. And so there are groups like Volt Typhoon, which you may have heard about. This is Microsoft's name for the Chinese unit that's infiltrated our critical infrastructure. They've infiltrated our transportation systems, ports, they've come for the grid, and the one that scares me the most, water treatment facilities. These are targets that have no real intelligence, espionage, or IP value whatsoever. The only reason you would be in these systems is for pre-positioning in the event of some geopolitical conflict where they would want to hold us hostage. And so what we really talk about in cybersecurity right now is what Andrew Scott, who is my colleague at CISA, called the everything everywhere all at once cyber attack scenario. So imagine not one colonial pipeline, but many colonial pipelines across the country where you can't just get gas, you can't get clean water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, power, et cetera, et cetera. And you really have to start thinking of these as like a psychological warfare tool, because right now, and I don't know anymore with this administration, but right now we still generally feel that we would need to support Taiwan in the event she made a move on reunification. But what appetite would Americans have? What political appetite would we have if suddenly we can't get gas, if suddenly we can't travel anymore, if we can't get power, if we can't get clean water? And that is why cybersecurity is so important, and why we need to start thinking about cyber resilience. And we are at this major inflection point, and Ruth was totally correct, with AI. AI has tremendous cyber defense use cases. We can use it to do all the things that we are so lazy as humans that we just don't want to do, like run our software updates and patch systems and replace legacy software that can't even get patched, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it also introduces security vulnerabilities, and it also increases complexity, and it also increases our blind spots. And what did Ruth say in the last session? You can't, what was it, something about mud on the windshield? You can't drive with mud on the windshield. We are about to start baking these models into critical systems, and we will have far less visibility into things like backdoors, et cetera. And if we don't get this right, we're going to be in a situation that we're already in with Huawei, where Huawei came in. The U.S. government really did a questionable job lobbying to say don't use Huawei, but it got used. Its routers and switches made their way into cell towers all over rural America. Which, by the way, if you overlay a map of where these cell towers are and where pretty serious U.S. military installations are, they line up. And so there's been this incredible effort to try and rip out and replace these systems, and we've spent billions of dollars on it, and this was a huge priority for the Biden administration's FCC, and we still couldn't do it. So now imagine a situation where we just go full forward with AI, and we don't think about security. There's no ripping out and replacing. These systems are so complex, they introduce so much complexity to the supply chain, and ripping and replacing is not going to be possible at a certain level. And so that is why I think that these discussions are so important, because we can't talk about AI without talking about cybersecurity, and we can't talk about defense tech without talking about cybersecurity. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I knew this was going to be an uplifting end to the day of a fantastic program. Neil, congratulations on the foresight of you and your team here.
We'll have drinks after this.
They won't be enough. So let's integrate a little bit and let's talk about the future. When I started out in this game, I studied geopolitics, and it never went away. So it hasn't come back, because I've been doing this for, you can see, 40 years. And what have I been doing for those 25, 30 years in between when it supposedly went away? when I first started out, nothing was connected. So my refrigerator wasn't a source of vulnerability in my house. My refrigerator is so smart that I'm really worried what's going to happen to me. Back then, if you wanted to gain information, steal IP, it was sort of like gold in Fort Knox to be able to penetrate to get to what you needed. Now, everything is available. The other piece is that back in the day, there was something called the military-industrial complex, and it was a place, and you could restrict access to the place. And so if Soviet scientists came here to collaborate, and they did in big numbers, there were some labs that they were admitted to and other labs that were off limits to them. And it was very hard to penetrate those labs except if you recruited a spy on the inside of those labs. Now, a teenager in the basement who doesn't use shampoo and is just having fun can get into the lab. And so this is something that is hard for us to understand, the degree of vulnerability we have now, where everything is interconnected, and the military-industrial complex is this. That wasn't the case not long ago. Having said that, I think we need to bring in a few qualifiers. First, cyber warfare has not been a significant part of what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. In fact, almost everyone there is dying from artillery shells and shrapnel. And they're dying in really big numbers. At least 750,000 casualties on the Russian side, of which 250,000 or more are deaths, and some number that's less on the Ukrainian side, but is well over 300,000 casualties on their side too. And they're not dying from cyber intrusion, from turning off the water supply, from turning off the gas and oil pipelines. They're dying from 155 millimeter shells or old Soviet shells. You know, and as far as the drones go, I remember drones when I was growing up. They were called torpedoes. You could fire these autonomous systems at distance, and so there were many different weapons that were autonomous once they were set into motion. And so the change there is less radical sometimes than we understand. And also, to use drones, you have to get them into theater. So it's one thing when the front line is from this distance to the gentleman standing against the wall, and you put the drone up in the air, and you can get it into theater. It's another thing when you're talking about the Pacific Ocean and getting drones into theater. Then you're going to need something different from drones, even unmanned airplanes at scale, to get into theater. So a lot has changed, but what's changed is mostly the interconnectivity and the fact that the military-industrial complex is not a place anymore, but is software for the most part. So maybe Ukraine is the future of warfare, but the future of warfare is artillery shells killing people at mass scale, in a way. And one further point before we get to the future from the three panelists. Those people who are our adversaries are doing a lot of stuff to us. We generally don't talk about what we're doing to them. We generally don't talk about what systems of theirs we might be in, where our implants might be. We understand the eavesdropping because your former employer and other media properties publish a great number of eavesdrop conversation leaks and other information that shows just how deep our penetration of communications networks are, so that people without security clearance can understand the depth of our global electronic capabilities. The Chinese didn't have signal intelligence till Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden taught the Chinese how to do signal intelligence. So those people who think that he should be pardoned, think about where we'd be vis-a-vis China without the work that Edward Snowden did. But anyway, we're on the front foot here as well. And there are many things that we're doing and can do, and there's a little bit of deterrence where they can do it to us, but then again, can't we do it to them? And who's got the upper hand in that? It's hard to tell. Even for those who have classified access, it's hard to tell because you can't know everything about all the stuff that's going on. So it's a period of tremendous change and upheaval because of the interconnectivity and the transformation of the military-industrial complex, but there's also a lot of uncertainty about who's on the front foot and where, which is a good segue, I hope, to where this might be going. What might be happening? What are the scenarios? What could we imagine? In other words, if we do X, Y, and Z, where could we get? And if we don't do X, Y, and Z, where could we get, right? In 1960, the Pentagon was 36% of global R&D. Not American R&D, global R&D. Warfare and the military produced almost all the innovations of the past 200 years, taking only the past 200 years. What we know as Silicon Valley is a partnership with DARPA and DARPA's predecessors and everything else. So maybe that partnership, which was briefly severed, is going to come back. Maybe the future is recuperable here. Maybe a little bit of this and a little bit of that can get us to a better place. What Nicole hinted at the end when she gave the sort of two-pronged version of the AI. So let's have the panelists weigh in here on where we could be going or should be going. We'll start again with Raj.
Sure. Thanks. Thank you. I think you make a lot of really good points there about this divide, and particularly the 35% down to less than 1% today. And so the technologies that will be, so I guess I'll make 2 points here. Oh. So one, the technologies that are really important are being built by commercial companies, right? All the top AI LLM companies are mostly here in the Valley, and they're all privately funded. So I think there's a trend which is in the days of the torpedo or the stealth airplane, if you built something better than the adversary, you would classify it, you would protect it, you'd make sure those widgets didn't get sold, and you'd have some significant temporal advantage over the enemy, right? Years, decades even. I think today that doesn't hold true. One, the technologies are just more accessible, they're commercial. Two, because of cyber attacks, they're going to get stolen. But thirdly, and more importantly, it's just how fast and how rapidly innovation is changing, right? If you, again, I think the biggest lesson of Ukraine is less a drone or a howitzer. It is how fast is it changing? Like it's a cat and mouse, like the enemy always has a vote, right? We like to say. And it's changing not on like a monthly, but like an hourly, daily basis. Go out there, you'll see, they'll test out the latest jamming system against the Russians. They'll code it that afternoon, and they're flying it that evening, and then the next day it's the other one. So I think the advantage will go to the organization or the combatant that is faster in understanding, operationalizing, executing that new technology change. And your moat is not going to be just the tech, but how fast you can go at it. Okay, so what does that then mean for us here in the U.S.? So there's this sense in the Chinese CCP strategy of their civil-military fusion, where they have a CCP, a paracheck assigned to every single company that sits on the board, and God forbid we go to war, they could maybe call the DJI plant and say, hey, thanks for making all these drones. They're all now going to this place, and they're going to have facial recognition, and you're going to put this shape charge on it, right? They could do that. We don't necessarily have that. So I would say what we're going to see, Stephen, in the future, and what I'm beginning to see the early stages of, is our own American way of civil-military fusion, which is going to be based on doubling down what I think makes Western democracies strong, which is market capitalism, right? Where we've got these new companies coming up. We've got demand signals. We've got a heavy amount of interest in technologists wanting to go to government and vice versa. And so I think by being open and having free flow of talent and free flow of capital, which is, I think, what Silicon Valley at its heart is best at, is how we will win against the state-commanded economy of the CCP and their approach to it. And so I think there's lots of different ways for us, because then ultimately this is a human-to-human type of endeavor that we can bring people together. And unfortunately, in that same 25-year period that you were, not wondering, we here in the U.S. made a couple of decisions that I think brought our military complex and technology complexes apart. Right here in the Bay Area, we have shuttered every active duty base within 50 miles. So there is no opportunity for a technologist to have a personal relationship with someone that's serving in uniform, right? And understanding their motivations and their families and having that visceral connection. And so there's lots of different initiatives. DARPA and Arati did a lot of great work out here. Pentagon's got an outpost. So I think we're getting better, but that's I think what we'll see is unique ways of this coming together.
Raj, since you published your book, which was not very long ago, have you rethought any of the fantastic arguments that you laid down in the book? Just your point about how things are changing really fast. Did you miss anything in the book that's a lesson for those of us who've read the book and absorbed its lessons?
I mean, I think the biggest thing I would say is, and it's been in our history in this country, is just we never have a big enough imagination, right? The lack of imagination on 9/11, the lack of imagination in December 7th, 1944, and even what we saw here in Ukraine. And so I think even understanding just how fast things are changing, even take the AI world, right? And I'm not a deep technologist relative to others here in the audience, but I think the DeepSeek news shows that there's going to be greater democratization, right? So even if they spent $60 million to build it, not $6 million, they certainly didn't spend $2 billion, right? And so again, this concept of speed that we thought, hey, look, why are all the leading LLM places here? We're going to have an advantage. Maybe that's not true. Okay. So being more imaginative.
Thank you.
I want to follow on. I appreciate a lot of Raj's comments, but I want to come back to where you started, which I really think is important. Because the core question is, how do we prevail in deterring and defeating, if necessary, in a military conflict in a world in which everyone gets access to leading edge technology, right? That we are so used to this post-World War II era in which we have all the marbles and no one else gets to play. That is not the world that we're in. And I think you are right on target because a couple of things. Number one is it's going to be about how rapidly you adapt. It's going to be about how rapidly you adapt in acquisition all the way to in the battlefield. And the great strength of our military, I know our military not from having served in it like you did, but as a researcher trying to figure out how to be useful to our military. And it took me a long time to figure out that what our military does all day long is train. They practice and they train, they work on this scenario and they red team each other. And that integration of tactics and getting that muscle memory of using technology and opening all of our military service members' creativity with technology, that combined with advanced technology that's our game. I mean, that's how we're going to win. And just to give a little historical dimension to this conversation, what happened in the height of the Cold War, and Bill Perry, has been at Stanford forever, was such a key player in this, was in order to prevail over a numerically superior adversary in the Soviet Union, we took a radically different stance. And all of human history was building weapons that were larger and larger and larger, right? All the way to nuclear weapons. It was all about mass. And in the Cold War, we shifted to a very different strategy, which was precision. And it was based on the idea that we could use then proprietary to us technologies, from stealth to GPS to all the electronics and sensing and computing, Bill Perry, as back in the Carter administration when he was in the Pentagon, said, if we do this, if we use all this amazing American technology, we can prevail over a numerically superior adversary, and we will have an advantage that lasts for 40 years in the 1970s. And he was right, and we had it, and now that's 50 years ago, and that's the problem, is that's not where we are anymore. And so in our time, both of us were in the Pentagon at the same time. Bob Work was Deputy Secretary, Ash Carter was the Secretary, and Bob Work used to talk all the time about a third offset strategy. It's the next revolution to follow the shift to precision combat. And what we, all of us, worked very hard on was how to, instead of going from one point of capability to another point of capability, you now need to be on an escalator and just be always able to iterate and get better and faster and train and have the military capability to succeed that's dynamic at all levels. So, I think we are on track to do that. And so since we need a little optimism, let's talk about that. Because I think that's the direction our military is going. And with the integration of core technologies from Silicon Valley, but then really making sure they integrate into systems that work for really harsh circumstances, that's what the future looks like, where we can win.
I want to make one comment, and then it'd be a nice segue to Nicole, because I'd love to hear her views on the cyber standpoint. I want to say something that's probably super obvious, but is worth saying. That the whole point of having a really strong military is to deter war, right? Not to just win, but to deter war. And you want to have such an unfair advantage that nobody wants to try to pick a fight with you. And usually we've done that through exercises and showing what we can do and our capabilities and how many numbers, right? You park the airplanes outside so the Russian satellite can take a picture. But when so much now of war is going into cyber, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we show this so no one wants to pick a fight with us?
So, sorry, the last section was a little too depressing for everyone. I'm not doing so. I didn't do sober January this January. It's not a time to be sober. I'll see you at the drinks. So, that's let me just address something Stephen said. I always say it's a little bit of a misdiagnosis to say that we didn't see any kind of cyber warfare in Ukraine. It turns out cyber warfare is strategic to a point. It doesn't matter that you're hacking the power station if you're just going to drop a bomb on it later. But we did see a lot of activity in those first days. We saw actually, and it is optimistic to think about what came of it. We saw Russia hack Viasat, this broadband internet company, but then in came Elon Musk and Starlink, and that kept all their military comms alive and gave Ukraine this fighting chance initially. We did catch them in these several Ukrainian power substations, but ESET, working with Cyber Defense Agency and CISA and NSA and our allies, were able to root out that malware before they could actually turn the power off. And we saw this across a number of sectors, and it really came down to this amazing public-private collaboration that sprang up. We've talked about this forever. It took a huge hit during the Snowden era, but it was amazing to kind of see it come back together. And we always talked about these hurdles and silos to public-private collaboration. Turns out all you need is a Slack channel. These Slack channels suddenly came alive, and everyone was volunteering their best and brightest to help with Ukraine's cyber defense. So that's amazing. Another point of optimism is, and another reason why we have to keep these multilateral relationships healthy and alive. Another point of optimism is that what is really scary about these Chinese cyber attacks I mentioned, and getting back to Raj's point about deterrence, is you can build up the biggest military in the world, but what we're seeing is that China and some of these other actors are coming for our civilian systems. And that's why it's such an asymmetric playing field. And that's where we really lack the imagination, right? And we're really whenever I talk about this, people say what you said, Stephen, but aren't we the best? And I don't know, because these two have a much better purview than I did. But my sense is no one has pulled off another Stuxnet. They've gotten close, but I think the US and Israel are probably at the top of the heap when it comes to cyber offense. And the story I always tell is that the New York Times, David Sanger and I learned that during Trump 1, Cyber Command got new leeway to launch attacks without presidential approval, and that one of the first things they did was they started hacking the Russian power grid and making a really loud show of it. And I remember we called up the National Security Council at the time, and I thought it was going to be one of these like painful conversations that journalists have with senior NSC officials where they were going to say, you can't possibly publish this, you'll have blood on your hands. And instead they said, we have no problem with you publishing this, Nicole, like, go ahead. And the reason why they had no problem with us publishing it is because they wanted Russia to know that we were in their systems too. So that if they ever did to us what they had done to Ukraine, where they shut the power off, not once, but twice, they could expect the same in return. And that's what I call mutually assured digital destruction. And that's the era we're in. Now, the problem is that we may be the best on offense, but on defense, and this is where we really have the biggest blind spot, 80% of America's critical infrastructure is in private sector hands. Pipelines, water networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What that means is that despite the takeaways from Snowden, the NSA doesn't have, direct visibility or real-time access to this critical infrastructure where Chinese hackers are now living off the land. They have to learn about these hacks from the victims, or maybe in the course of some of these intelligence agencies' foreign signals intelligence operations, they'll learn about it and tip off the FBI, who will go warn these entities. But for the most part, we have to rely on the public sector basically notifying the government when they've been breached. And a lot of times they're not really incentivized to look. And when you look at how these Chinese attacks on our infrastructure are playing out, we're calling them living off the land because they don't hack in anymore, they log in. They're not using malware. They're just there to make sure that they are there and that they stay there in the event they'd have to do something one day. So they are much harder to catch. And that creates this huge, huge blind spot on cyber defense. And I think it creates an opening for adversaries to essentially come in through civilian infrastructure. Now, I don't want to leave it there, and I don't want to be the most depressing speaker on this panel again, but the good news is with AI, we've been bringing down the discovery time for these hunt teams on these living off the land attacks from years, months even, down to, last count, days, and in one case, hours. So there's huge potential on cyber defense, and there's really promising use cases for this. But unfortunately, we're in this quagmire that we're in, and it's going to take some time.
Stephen, can I ask Nicole a question about this? So cyber defense isn't finding out what happened quickly, right? I mean, you need to do that. But cyber defense is it doesn't happen. And my question, this is the boringest thing in cyber. No one ever wants to talk about it. But the fact of the matter is, every cyber attack that you mentioned, that I know of, that I've dug into, it turned out that the entity that was hacked was not up to date on updates.
Yes.
And very much to your point, like people don't get around to doing it. But I've had so many conversations with boards of directors who, to them, cyber is really important because they're going to get sued if there's a breach. And so they have a long checklist, but it's not really translating into making the investments. My thesis is that cyber risk is hard to quantify or calibrate or assess. Cyber security costs are very tangible, and so you shrug. And so that's why the water system doesn't upgrade its legacy system that no one was thinking about cybersecurity when they built it in the 1980s or whatever it was. So how do you see us changing this really boring thing that if people just did the upgrades that they know they need to do, we would be so much more cyber secure?
Yeah. It's the same phrase we've heard all day, which is, we're waiting for it to get so bad that we take action on it. That's just been the story in cyber forever. And you have these inflection points with Colonial Pipeline, with SolarWinds. And you hope that we will see real cybersecurity regulations on critical infrastructure. And actually, if you ask people in the security teams at these companies, including in critical infrastructure, would you welcome this regulation? The answer is yes. But every time we've tried to pass it, the Chamber of Commerce has come in, lobbyists have come in and said it's too onerous, right. it's too burdensome, it's too expensive.
Yeah, but we all pay the price when those companies aren't making those investments, and I think that's the problem. Yeah.
Everyone, please click on your update
Right now.
right now. I think before you forget and regret, if I can just follow up Nicole's point there. Who would like to raise their hand and delay our move into the reception? I saw a hand in the back, and then I saw that table in the back, and then I saw table 12. One question per person, please.
Sure. I got to co-chair the technology post 9/11 on need to note and need to share of data, and have been involved in national security ever since. On this last point, I'm very curious about, I know the Defense Science Board put out a paper on China's infiltration into the critical systems. I believe it is still public, or it has been public. I'm curious, can we do a better job of marketing as we did in the Y2K problem, which didn't happen because it was a marketed problem. We got to talk about it publicly a lot, and it was really the private sector that engaged and stepped up to do that because we were much clearer about what was going on.
All right, hold that, and we'll take the table 12 question, and then you guys can respond as you see fit. We need a mic at table 12, please. Thank you, sir.
David Lichtinger, SIEPR Advisory Board member. There's a question for Raj. Raj, given your experience with DIU, and given our real problem about procurement of both quantity and the right types of weapons, but quantity, like Stephen's talking about, consumables like artillery shells and drones, if the current Secretary of Defense was to talk to you and ask you, what is the best way for us to make some simple changes so we could bridge that valley of death, what ideas would you have for him?
All right, so we got two questions, and we'll start with the first question.
Nicole?
I always say if cybersecurity, or this issue was purely a technology problem, we would have solved it 20 years ago. And the reason we didn't solve it is because it's not just a technology problem. It's an incentives problem. It's a leadership problem. It's a budget allocation problem. It's an HR education problem. But I think telling the story in this case has been hard. But what I saw at the New York Times was I didn't want to be, the girl crying wolf. And there were plenty of cybersecurity companies out there who were stoking what we call FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, to sell their mousetraps, and did us a tremendous disservice in this space, I think. But at a certain point, things flipped, and this threat got very serious, and to where we are now, where they're inside the house, right? And I think telling this story is really important, but you can't just scare everyone. You have to give them action items. And I think the biggest action item is resilience. And some of it is super boring. It's patch your software, run your software updates. But a lot of it is actually, again, I'm just going to re-quote something Ruth said earlier, identify your biggest vulnerability and protect that. What are your crown jewels? What's the thing that if it goes down, it's game over for you or your business or your family or whatever it is, and wrap the moat around that, and then start creating circles of defense. And unfortunately right now, so much of our critical infrastructure is just run on these old legacy systems. And I think the only way we're going to get there, it's not just a marketing story, it's no, you actually have to pass regulations to force these companies to meet NIST standards. And where I see my role is someone who was not technical in this space, who literally got dropped into the deep end and forced to swim in it, was how do I handhold people, hold their hands and walk them into the space and say, this is happening. And a lot of it just comes down to, we all have to do our part here. So anyway, I'm launching a podcast. It's called To Catch a Thief. It's on Chinese cyber espionage, and it'll be out in 2 weeks. So
There you go.
Follow it now.
Normally, I'm very loath to do any kind of commercials when I'm on a stage, but my last company's name is Cyber Resilience.
Right.
But I think to your point, right, so if you look at the history of cyber attacks, 95% of most breaches are caused by blocking and tackling errors. didn't patch your system, you didn't have two-factor auth, somebody clicked a cat picture that they shouldn't have. And all these things, as Nicole's right on, are not technology problems, they're behavioral problems. And so then again, I go back to where I started on this is like, let's use market economies to solve it. So one way that the company that I had a chance of starting does is gives you a cyber insurance policy. We'll write you a $10 million policy for your ransomware, but only if you keep your two-factor on, and we're gonna check it every second. And then when you turn it off, your policy goes down to $1 million. Well, now the CEO has a reason to call the IT guy and say, hey, I know you turned it off because of some really important technical reason, but I need you to turn it back on because we have $9 million of exposure on our balance sheet. Yeah. Maybe I'll segue to the other question. There's been so much talked about Valley of Death, acquisition reform. I sat, I think, on the 42nd Blue Ribbon panel on reform, and so our report is now keeping dust off another piece of shelf next to the other 41. And really, I don't think the Pentagon can solve it themselves. It's really the first branch of government, and it's got to be the legislative branch that says, we're going to give the right amount of flexibility. We do multi-year contracting. Are we going to remove this CR, which, I mean, is crazy. I mean, what's even more, probably heretical is what company has two budget committees? Someone that says this is what we should buy, and then someone says, well, here's where I'm going to give you the money, right? Appropriations and authorizations. So I think there's a whole slew of things, but I think it's got to start from Congress.
Can I just tag on to that and say,
yes, last word.
Every congressman I've ever met who has a defense contractor in their district knows so much about why that is the thing that you have to have to save the free world. And it comes down to very local things like that, but it ends up being a hodgepodge.
The F-35 isn't built in 48 states by accident.
God, exactly, yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Raj, Arati, Nicole, let's give it up.
All right, great to do that with you.
Nice job.